By the late 1980s, Soviet factory managers were paying a 30% fee to turn one kind of ruble into another kind of ruble. Same currency, same state, same face of Lenin on the bill. The only difference was which ledger the money lived in. One ledger was restricted, the other was not. And the 30% was what it cost to cross from one side to the other. This premium has a name. It appears in the post-Soviet banking records. The name is obnalichka. Obnalichka. And understanding why it existed is the most useful thing a historian can tell you about programmable money. If the two currencies looked identical, felt identical, and were both issued by the same state, what exactly were those managers paying to escape? That question has an answer. The answer is in the archives, and it's older than most people think. Start with what the system actually was. Not the theory, the mechanism. In 1977, an economist at the National Bureau of Economic Research named George Garvy published a monograph called Money, Financial Flows, and Credit in the Soviet Union. Garvy was not a dissident. He was not a Cold War partisan. He was a technical monetary economist, and he spent 300 pages describing, in precise detail, something most Western readers had never heard of. The Soviet Union had two rubles, not two currencies in the sense of dollar and euro, two tiers of the same ruble, structurally separated by law, enforced by the central bank, and unable to cross into each other except through official permission. The first tier was called nalichny, cash, physical bills, what workers got paid with, what citizens used to buy bread and shoes and vodka at the state store. The second tier was called beznalichny, literally cashless. This was the money the Soviet economy actually ran on. When a steel factory in Magnitogorsk sold steel to a tractor plant in Kharkov, no physical bills changed hands. A Gosbank clerk moved numbers from one ledger column to another. That was the transaction. The steel was real. The tractors were real. The money was an entry in a book. Enterprises held billions in beznalichny credits. They could use those credits, but only for things the central plan had pre-approved. They could not legally convert the credits into nalichny cash. They could not pay workers with beznalichny. They could not buy unauthorized supplies with it. They could not take it home. This is not a metaphor for programmable money. This is programmable money. The same concept, a different century. Garvy saw the problem immediately. He was writing in 1977, and the Soviet system had already been running for 40 years. The flaw he documented was not ideological, it was structural. The central plan assumed that every economic need could be anticipated and authorized in advance. Real economies don't work that way. A factory manager in Sverdlovsk needed a replacement bearing for a press. The central plan had not authorized this purchase. There was no administrative channel for emergency parts. But the production quota was real. If the press stopped, the quota failed. If the quota failed, the manager's career ended. So the manager found a way. He always found a way. He would call a contact at another enterprise. He would arrange an off-books exchange. He would find someone with access to physical nalichny cash, an actual stack of rubles, and he would negotiate. The negotiation had a price. The price was the premium. In the early years, the premium was small, 10%, 15%, a nuisance. By the 1980s, the premium had climbed to 30%, and the volume had grown from a handful of informal exchanges into a shadow economy representing, according to academic reconstructions, roughly 12.6% of Soviet GDP across the 1960 to 1990 period. By 1990, that figure was 15.7%. Here is the part that matters. The state knew. The economists knew. Garvy knew in 1977 and wrote it down. The Soviet authorities could not fix it, because every enforcement action that closed an obnalichka channel also reduced actual production. The tighter the control, the greater the incentive to escape it. The system was structurally self-defeating. This was not a bug in the implementation. This was what happens at scale when a state attempts to separate ledger credits from physical, fungible currency. The mechanism that was supposed to guarantee control became the mechanism that guaranteed the black market. Now step back. The Soviet case was the most comprehensive experiment with tiered, programmable money. It was not the only one. In 1789, the French National Assembly authorized the first 400 million livres of assignats, originally interest-bearing bonds backed by confiscated church land. By 1790, they were fiat currency. By 1793, the law of the maximum made it a criminal offense to prefer gold over paper. The penalty began at 6 years' imprisonment. It was later extended to death. And on June 17, 1795, in a coffee house on the Rue Saint-Honoré, a Parisian named Dufresnoy was observed by plainclothes agents of the revolutionary state while he held an assignat note up to the window and tried to calculate its real value in gold. The report was filed that afternoon. It exists. You can read it. This is the earliest documented instance of a private citizen being surveilled specifically for questioning whether his state currency was worth anything. It is not the last. In 1932, in the small Austrian town of Wörgl, Mayor Michael Unterguggenberger issued a local currency that depreciated 1% per month, a demurrage scrip designed to force circulation. Local unemployment fell 16%, while national unemployment rose 19%. Roughly 200 Austrian municipalities expressed interest in replicating it. The Austrian National Bank obtained a Supreme Court ruling and shut it down. The experiment was unwound in 8 days. Programmable expiration. That was Wörgl's contribution to the historical record, money that ate itself on a schedule. In 1933, Hjalmar Schacht became president of the Reichsbank in Nazi Germany. Within a year, he had created a parallel currency through a dummy corporation called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft. The instrument was called the MEFO bill. By 1938, according to standard academic estimates, 12 billion Reichsmark of military debt was hidden inside this off-budget ledger. In a memorandum dated May 3, 1935, Schacht told Hitler that the armaments were being financed from the blocked accounts of political opponents and foreigners. The memo was unsigned. It is in the archive. Demographic tiering. That was Schacht's contribution. One currency for citizens in good standing. Another, radically different, for citizens the state had decided to isolate. And in 1942, the United States Office of Price Administration issued 123 million ration books across the American population. Every transaction required two currencies, dollars and ration points. Specific categories of goods could be purchased only with specific categories of points. A meat packer in Cleveland was offered $75,000, roughly $1.3 million in 2023 terms, as a bribe to sell meat at the official ceiling price rather than on the black market. Categorical restrictions. That was the American contribution. Money that could only be spent on certain things in certain amounts for a certain duration. 4 different states, 4 different centuries, 4 different mechanisms. All of them aimed at the same thing, the programmability of what money could do once it left the state's hand. Now the part that matters most, the people. Begin in Sosnowiec in Silesia in the late 1930s. The grandfather of the writer Menachem Kaiser, also named Menachem, owned a family apartment building, substantial real property, the kind of asset that defined middle-class Jewish wealth in Central Europe. When the Nazi capital controls tightened, Menachem, the grandfather, did what any rational owner would do. He tried to liquidate. He could not. Under the Third Decree on Jewish assets, he was required to declare all holdings above 5,000 Reichsmark. The declaration gave the state a complete inventory of his wealth. The building was registered. The state knew exactly where it stood and exactly what it was worth. By the end of the decade, the property had been seized. Menachem survived the war. He reached Toronto. He never saw the building again. Now look at a different man, the same decade, different city. Heinrich Schwabacher was a coin dealer in Frankfurt. He held rare numismatic coins, real estate, and, crucially, physical gold. An 1895 gold pocket watch, gold wedding rings. These were objects, not ledger entries. Objects you could wrap in cloth and put in a package. So that is what he did. He wrapped the gold watch. He wrapped the wedding rings. He sent them, through the regular postal system, to Christian friends in Amsterdam. He bypassed the Reichsflugsteuer. He bypassed the Sperrmark conversion machinery, which by 1938 was charging emigrants up to 96% of their assets to access their own money abroad. He bypassed the state's entire surveillance architecture, because the architecture had been built to watch bank accounts and real estate. It had not been built to watch a registered letter carrying a pocket watch. In 1939, the Schwabacher family emigrated to England. The gold was waiting for them in Amsterdam, unopened. Heinrich Schwabacher's choices in the late 1930s are worth examining as history, a window into how people actually behaved when the familiar systems they had trusted stopped working. They are not a blueprint for anyone today. They are a record of what one man did when the rules changed, and the archives show how it worked out for him. Now go east. In Zaporozhye, during the famine years of 1932 and 1933, an anonymous Soviet citizen walked into a Torgsin store. Torgsin was the state's hard currency shop network, a system that accepted foreign currency, gold, and silver in exchange for the scarce food that ordinary rubles could no longer buy. The citizen had $30. He deposited them in full compliance with state procedure. The OGPU, the secret police, ordered the store director to transfer the balance to the State Industrialization Fund. No warrant, no judicial process, a bureaucratic memo. The citizen lost the currency. He lost the access to food. He had done everything the system asked of him, and the system had converted his compliance into confiscation without explanation. This is the difference. Menachem's grandfather held a building. The Zaporozhye customer held an account. Heinrich Schwabacher held a pocket watch and trusted a postman. 3 people, 3 asset classes, 3 ledger visibilities, 2 total losses, 1 preservation. Return to the question the hook opened with. Why were Soviet factory managers in the 1980s paying 30% to turn one kind of ruble into another? Because the restricted ledger had become a trap. Credits piled up in accounts that couldn't buy what the managers actually needed: a replacement part, an unauthorized hire, an informal supplier connection. Physical nalichny cash was the only form of money that could move freely. The 30% was the tax the trap charged for its own escape route. By the late 1980s, the obnalichka economy had become so structural that the Soviet state quasi-legalized it through institutions called the Centers for Scientific and Technical Creativity of the Youth. On paper, these were innovation hubs for young scientists. In practice, they were ledger-to-cash conversion vehicles. The state had stopped fighting the shadow economy. It had built an office for it. And then there was Andrei Amal'rik. In 1969, Amal'rik was an active political dissident. He had smuggled a manuscript to the British journal Survey, a book called Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984? And the British publisher paid him royalties in pounds sterling. Amal'rik did something remarkable. He routed the payment through the official Soviet banking system. He converted the pounds into a third-tier currency certificate called a stripeless Vneshpozltorg voucher, the highest level of Soviet currency substitute, specifically reserved for holders of foreign hard currency. And he used the vouchers at Berioska stores, the restricted retail outlets where ordinary rubles were not accepted. The state tolerated the entire transaction. Why? Because at the macro level, the Soviet government needed foreign exchange more than it needed to punish one dissident. Even for a man whose writing the regime considered treason, the structural need for hard currency outranked the ideological enforcement. Amal'rik walked into a Berioska and bought a tape recorder. From the 7 documented cases threaded through this video, Menachem Kaiser's grandfather, Heinrich Schwabacher, the Zaporozhye Torgsin customer, Gouverneur Morris in revolutionary Paris, the jubilant debtor of 1796, Andrei Amal'rik, and the Cleveland meatpacker, three patterns emerge. 1. Physical, unledgered assets provided the only reliable exit route, 4 of 7. 2. Assets held on state-monitored ledgers were vulnerable to administrative seizure without judicial process, 2 of 7. 3. Access to foreign hard currency created structural advantage even under maximum domestic control, 3 of 7. These are observations from 7 historical cases across 5 monetary regimes between 1789 and 1991. They are what the record shows. They are not general survival advice. They are a description of what happened to specific people under specific laws in specific years. The Soviet dual-tier system did not end with a reform. It ended with the state. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The beznalichny and nalichny separation dissolved with it, and the shadow economy that had grown underneath, 12.6% of GDP in the average Soviet decade, 15.7% by 1990, expanded to 48.73% of GDP by 1997. Nearly half of the post-Soviet Russian economy was now operating outside the official ledger. This is what an economist at the Hoover Institution named Michael Bordo found when he examined the historical record on central bank monopolies in 2021. Every historical transition from competing currencies to central bank monopoly, Bordo documented, was accompanied by the suppression of alternatives, including the use of legal force to eliminate parallel systems. The Soviet case was not an outlier. It was one data point in a long series. Go back to France for one moment. On February 18, 1796, the printing plates for the assignat, the automated, sequentially numbered plates that the revolutionary state had used to enforce its monetary monopoly, were carried to the Place Vendôme and burned in public. A government destroyed its own money creation apparatus in front of a crowd. The experiment was over. The currency had cost the state more than it had gained. The assignat had lasted 7 years. The Soviet dual-tier ruble system had lasted 50. Both, in the end, were undone by the same pressure: the inability of a restricted ledger to absorb the real needs of a real economy without generating a shadow one. Here is what the historical record shows. Every attempt to program money, to restrict what it could buy, who could hold it, where it could go, has produced 3 predictable outcomes: a shadow economy, a premium on physical assets, and, eventually, either the reform of the system or the collapse of the state that built it. The documented record from 1789 to 1991 covers 5 separate monetary experiments on 3 continents. Each was engineered by serious people with serious intentions. Each produced the same structural response from the populations they were imposed upon. Not because those populations were disobedient, because the mechanism itself generated the response. What Menachem Kaiser's grandfather held could not be moved. What Heinrich Schwabacher held could be wrapped in cloth. What Andrei Amal'rik held had value in a tier the state had built specifically for foreign exchange. These are not lessons about what to do. These are facts about what happened. The archives remain open. The memos are cataloged. The police report from June 17, 1795 is still in Paris. Dufresnoy is still there, in a coffee house, holding a piece of paper up to the light. If you had been a truth many people had in BEFOR 1987, sitting in front of a ledger full of credits you couldn't legally spend, how far would you have gone, and how much would you have paid to turn those numbers into something you could hold in your hand?